The House chamber was thick with tension, the kind that only comes when the stakes are high and the players know the cameras are rolling. It was supposed to be a routine debate over the government funding bill, but everyone in the room sensed that something more was brewing. The air was charged not just with the usual partisan energy, but with the anticipation of a confrontation that would be replayed for days to come. At the center of it all sat former Speaker Kevin McCarthy, a man whose political career had been defined by his ability to command the floor, to bend the narrative, and to silence opposition with a well-timed interruption. He wore the look of someone who believed he still held the power to shape the conversation, even after being ousted from the speakership in a historic vote. His reputation as a fiscal hawk and a master of parliamentary maneuvering was well known, and he seemed ready to remind everyone of it. This time, the target of his interruption was not a rookie easily rattled by authority. Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman Democrat from Texas, was in the middle of a carefully constructed argument about fiscal responsibility. She spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had done her homework, citing deficit reduction measures and government efficiency proposals with the precision of a seasoned policy expert. Her words were measured, her tone unwavering, and her facts meticulously sourced. As Crockett outlined the long-term savings embedded in the bill, McCarthy's patience snapped. He raised his voice, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Will the gentle lady yield?" he called out, his tone dripping with impatience and authority. "Because I think the American people deserve to hear real facts about fiscal responsibility instead of the talking points the gentle lady is reading." The chamber fell silent. Members turned in their seats, some with curiosity, others with a sense of déjà vu. McCarthy had used this tactic countless times before, especially when challenging newer members he assumed would be easily unsettled. It was a move designed to seize control, to put his opponent on the defensive, and to reassert his dominance in a room that had once been his, but Crockett didn't flinch. She paused, looked McCarthy straight in the eye, and delivered a single sentence that would instantly shift the power dynamic. "Mr. McCarthy, I find it remarkable that you want to lecture anyone about fiscal responsibility after you added more to the national debt during your speakership negotiations than any speaker in modern history." The effect was immediate. The Democratic side erupted in applause. Several Republicans shifted uncomfortably, glancing at McCarthy to see how he would respond. In one precise, well-constructed sentence, Crockett had not only neutralized McCarthy's interruption but also reframed the entire debate. She reminded the chamber and the millions watching at home that McCarthy's credibility on fiscal issues was undermined by his own record. This wasn't just a clever comeback. It was a masterclass in preparation and timing. Crockett had anticipated the interruption, studied McCarthy's record, and armed herself with facts that would be impossible to dismiss. She knew that McCarthy's public image as a fiscal conservative was built on shaky ground, and she was ready to expose the gap between his rhetoric and reality. McCarthy, caught off guard, tried to recover. "Will the gentle lady yield for a question?" he pressed, hoping to regain control of the exchange. Crockett's response was firm. "I will not yield at this time. The gentleman interrupted my remarks to say he wanted to present facts. I am now presenting documented facts from nonpartisan sources, and I intend to finish my statement." The presiding officer nodded, allowing Crockett to continue. She turned back to the chamber, her voice steady. During Mr. McCarthy's negotiations to secure the speakership, he made a series of promises to members of his caucus that independent analysts estimated would raise the deficit by roughly $190 billion over a decade. These commitments included limits on revenue options, restrictions on budgeting flexibility, and spending caps that did not account for inflation or population growth. She held up a document for emphasis. And during the debt ceiling negotiations that Mr. McCarthy now calls his great example of fiscal responsibility, the deal he struck lifted the debt limit through January 2025, without creating the type of long-term fiscal structure true conservatives have demanded for years. The agreement included about $60 billion in cuts over 2 years, but much of that came from accounting shifts rather than real reductions. Meanwhile, the plan preserved every major tax cut that has driven deficit growth for the last 20 years. The Republican side grew restless. McCarthy, visibly irritated, signaled to the presiding officer that he wanted to be recognized for a response. But Crockett pressed on, refusing to cede the floor. The Congressional Budget Office projected that the fiscal year 2024 deficit would reach roughly $2 trillion, hundreds of billions higher than previous baseline estimates. That increase occurred while Mr. McCarthy was Speaker. These are not my interpretations. These are the findings of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the chamber. The gentleman interrupted me to suggest that I was relying on talking points instead of engaging with real fiscal data. But every statement I've made comes directly from official budget reports and independent fiscal experts. Meanwhile, the gentleman's description of his own record depends on selective numbers that leave out the broader consequences of his decisions. The chamber was silent, the usual back and forth replaced by a sense that something important had just happened. Crockett had not only defended herself, she had taken control of the narrative, exposing the weaknesses in McCarthy's argument and demonstrating the power of preparation over reputation. McCarthy, now visibly unsettled, tried to pivot. The gentle lady is engaging in partisan revisionism that makes honest fiscal debate impossible. Yes, I negotiated with my caucus to become Speaker. Yes, I worked to reach difficult agreements. But calling those negotiations fiscally irresponsible ignores the political realities of leading a narrow majority. Crockett didn't miss a beat. Mr. Speaker, the gentleman now argues that political realities required the fiscal decisions he made. That is exactly my point. The gentleman made choices based on political pressure, yet interrupted my remarks to claim special authority on fiscal responsibility. He cannot say that political conditions forced him to make decisions that increase deficits while also claiming those same decisions demonstrate fiscal discipline. These two positions cannot coexist. The logic was unbreakable. Crockett's calm, pointed delivery made it clear that she wasn't just trading barbs. She was exposing a contradiction at the heart of McCarthy's argument. The chamber, sensing the shift, grew even more attentive. Democrats leaned forward, energized by the clarity of her rebuttal. Even some moderate Republicans looked uneasy, recognizing that Crockett's points were rooted in documented fact, not partisan spin. McCarthy, realizing he was losing ground, tried to shift the argument again. The debt ceiling agreement prevented a catastrophic economic default. That was the responsible thing to do. Crockett nodded, acknowledging the importance of avoiding default. No one disputes that preventing default was necessary. But the deal could have included stronger long-term reforms. If the gentleman had negotiated more effectively instead of pursuing short-term political wins, the result was a patchwork agreement that did little to address the underlying drivers of the deficit. She continued, "When the gentleman points to specific spending cuts in his agreements, independent analyses show those cuts were offset by increased spending in other areas. And when he claims Democratic policies created the fiscal problems he inherited, the data shows that tax cuts championed by Republicans contributed more to deficit growth than Democratic spending increases." The presiding officer allowed Crockett to continue, recognizing the significance of the moment. She turned to the chamber, her voice unwavering. "Here's what I find especially interesting about the former speaker's interruption. He repeatedly portrayed himself as a fiscal conservative who was finally reining in spending. But when we look at the actual outcomes of the policies he supported and the agreements he reached, we see that the deficit increased under his leadership." She lifted another document. "This is the Congressional Budget Office. Analysis outlining the deficit effects of legislative actions taken during the last congressional session. The debt ceiling deal, the appropriations agreements, and the revenue choices all contributed to higher long-term deficits than what would have occurred under earlier policy. These are not my interpretations. These are the findings of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office." McCarthy, now on the defensive, tried to interrupt again. "The gentle lady is misrepresenting my record and ignoring the context of the difficult fiscal conditions I faced." Crockett responded instantly. "Mr. Speaker, I have not made personal attacks. I have cited official budget documents and independent analyses. If the gentleman believes those sources are incorrect, he should identify which specific findings are wrong rather than dismissing factual information as personal criticism. The chamber erupted in applause from the Democratic side. Even some Republicans seemed to recognize the strength of her argument. Crockett's approach was devastating because it placed McCarthy in a lose-lose situation. He could try to dispute the technical details and budget analyses, something he was not prepared to do, or he could continue labeling documented data as personal attacks, making himself appear defensive and unwilling to confront the facts. The exchange continued for several more minutes as McCarthy tried different arguments to recover from the damage done to his fiscal narrative. When he argued that the debt ceiling agreement prevented a catastrophic economic default, Crockett replied that the deal could have included stronger long-term reforms if he had negotiated more effectively. When he pointed to specific spending cuts, Crockett presented analyses showing those cuts were offset by increased spending elsewhere. When he claimed Democratic policies created the fiscal problems he inherited, she answered with data showing that Republican tax cuts contributed more to deficit growth than Democratic spending. The effectiveness of Crockett's approach was confirmed on multiple levels. First, the immediate reaction on the House floor made her impact unmistakable. Democrats were energized, appreciating that Crockett had not only defended herself but had used McCarthy's interruption to expose weakness in Republican fiscal arguments. Several members even asked for copies of the documents she referenced so they could use similar evidence in their own speeches. More importantly, Republican members became noticeably subdued. McCarthy's interruption had been intended to reassert relevance and authority despite losing the speakership. Instead of strengthening his position, the exchange only highlighted how much McCarthy's credibility had eroded on the very issues where he insisted he was an expert. Several moderate Republicans later told reporters that McCarthy's interruption backfired, drawing attention to fiscal weaknesses the party preferred not to spotlight. Media coverage reinforced this outcome. Most outlets focused on Crockett's fact-based rebuttals rather than McCarthy's attempted criticisms. Cable networks repeatedly aired footage of her citing Congressional Budget Office reports and challenging McCarthy to specify which of her statements were incorrect. Analysts noted that she came armed with detailed evidence. While McCarthy relied mostly on broad claims and references to his past experience, fact-checkers and budget specialists highlighted the contrast even more sharply. Multiple reviews confirmed that Crockett's assertions about deficit projections and the fiscal impact of McCarthy's agreements were consistent with CBO data and independent fiscal evaluations. Meanwhile, McCarthy's portrayal of his own record was often rated as misleading or lacking essential context. The chamber, the press, and the public had witnessed a rare moment. A newer member of Congress not only holding her own against a former speaker, but turning his own tactics against him with preparation, poise, and irrefutable facts. The aftermath of the confrontation was felt far beyond the House chamber. Clips of Crockett's response to McCarthy spread rapidly across social media, with hashtags like #CrockettShutsDown McCarthy and #facts over rhetoric trending within hours. Political commentators on both sides of the aisle weighed in, but the consensus was clear. Crockett had not only survived a high-pressure interruption from a seasoned political operator, she had turned it into a defining moment of her own. In the days that followed, Crockett's office was inundated with messages of support. Young lawmakers and aspiring public servants cited her as an example of how preparation and substance could overcome even the most entrenched political power. Budget analysts and policy experts praised her for bringing clarity to a debate too, often clouded by slogans and selective statistics. Even some of McCarthy's former allies privately admitted that the exchange had exposed vulnerabilities in the Republican fiscal narrative that would be hard to repair. Meanwhile, the Democratic caucus took note. Crockett's method, using documented evidence, refusing to be rattled by status or seniority, and calmly insisting on facts, became a model for others. Party leaders began encouraging members to adopt her approach in future debates, arming themselves with nonpartisan data and challenging opponents to defend their records with specifics, not just rhetoric. A new rapid response team was formed, specializing in budget policy and fact-checking. With Crockett playing a key advisory role, the media too shifted its coverage. Journalists who had once defaulted to, she said, reporting began to dig deeper, comparing politicians' claims to actual budget data. Several major outlets published investigative pieces analyzing the real impact of McCarthy's fiscal decisions, often referencing Crockett's floor speech as the catalyst for a more evidence-based approach to political coverage. Fact-checking organizations updated their methods, providing more context and background whenever lawmakers referenced their financial records, but perhaps the most significant impact was on the culture of Congress itself. Lawmakers from both parties became more cautious about making sweeping statements on fiscal responsibility, knowing that such claims could now be directly challenged with official figures. The old playbook, interrupt, dominate, and rely on reputation, no longer guaranteed victory. Instead, the new standard was set. Come prepared, cite your sources, and be ready to defend your record with facts. For McCarthy, the consequences were immediate and lasting. His attempt to reassert authority on fiscal issues had backfired spectacularly. Instead of restoring his standing, the exchange with Crockett became a reference point for his diminished credibility. Whenever he spoke about budget matters in subsequent debates, Democratic members would remind colleagues of the confrontation and cite the same budget research Crockett had used. His influence within the Republican conference waned, and he found himself increasingly sidelined in key negotiations. Eventually, he announced he would not seek re-election, citing several reasons, but insiders widely recognized that his loss of effectiveness was a major factor. Crockett, on the other hand, saw her profile rise dramatically. She was invited to appear on national news programs to discuss fiscal policy, and her online following grew as clips of her exchange with McCarthy continued to circulate. Democratic leaders sought her input on messaging and strategy, and she became a go-to voice for evidence-based debate on budget issues. Her approach, thorough preparation, calm delivery, and relentless focus on facts, became a template for a new generation of lawmakers. The lessons from that day extended beyond the specifics of fiscal policy. Crockett's performance demonstrated that in a democratic system, authority is only as strong as the credibility that supports it. When the gap between rhetoric and record is exposed, titles and experience offer no shield. Preparation, documentation, and clarity can overcome even the most entrenched power structures. In the months that followed, Congress saw a subtle but important shift. Debates became more substantive, with members on both sides more likely to reference official data and less likely to rely on empty slogans. Journalists and fact-checkers played a more active role in holding lawmakers accountable, and the public, empowered by examples like Crockett's, demanded more transparency and honesty from their representatives. For Crockett, the work continued. She joined a bipartisan working group on budget reform, determined to bring the same level of rigor and accountability to future negotiations. She mentored new members, sharing her approach to preparation and debate. And she never forgot the lesson of that day, that the most powerful tool in politics is not a title or a reputation, but the truth, clearly and confidently delivered. As she walked the halls of Congress, Crockett was often stopped by colleagues and constituents alike, thanking her for standing her ground and raising the bar for public discourse. She would smile, remind them that the real credit belonged to the facts, and return to her work, knowing that every debate, every vote, and every speech was another opportunity to prove that substance still matters. The confrontation between Kevin McCarthy and Jasmine Crockett became more than just a viral moment. It was a turning point, a reminder that, in the end, the strength of an argument is measured not by the volume of one's voice, but by the weight of one's evidence. And in that chamber, on that day, the evidence was on Crockett's side.